Genesis 32, 22 to 31. Thank you, Sheila.
The same night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask me my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he was leaving Peniel, limping because of his hip.
It's a strange story, isn't it? The one in the reading today. Somebody wrestling with God in the middle of the night and having his hip damaged. Maybe it would help us make more sense of it if you knew a bit more about Jacob.
Well, his name is a funny one. It means heel grabber, which is a strange name to give a child when he's born, if you ask me. He was said to have come out, though, grabbing onto his twin brother's heel. But in Hebrew, Jacob also means deceiver, which is another strange name to give a child, if you ask me. He was Isaac's son, he was Abraham's grandson, and he was always jealous of his older brother Esau, because being the older son, Esau would inherit everything, but he was only seconds or a minute or so older. Jacob tried to buy the right to inherit by forcing Esau to agree to this. When Esau came home one day starving, Jacob wouldn't let him have any food until Esau agreed to let Jacob inherit everything in his place. Then later, when their father Isaac died, knowing that his father had gone blind, Jacob deceived him into thinking that he was Esau, so he could have the blessing and the inheritance due to the eldest son.
Not a very pleasant man, this Jacob, then, was he?
Well, it doesn't look that way, does it? But Jacob was so scared of how Esau would react when he heard what he'd done that he ran away, 400 miles away, and got a job with his uncle Laban as a shepherd. At that point, the deceiver became the deceived, because Uncle Laban was as tricksy as Jacob was. Uncle Laban said that if Jacob worked for him for 7 years, he could marry his daughter Rachel, whom Jacob had fallen in love with. But then Laban did a switch at the last minute and tricked him into marrying his older daughter Leah. Jacob had to work another 7 years for Rachel. He then worked for another 6 years for his uncle after that, and Laban kept changing his wages for the worse. Eventually, God tells Jacob to go home, where he'll have to be reconciled with Esau. So he takes all his family and his servants and his flocks and his herds and all that he's built up over those 20 years, and he sets off on the long journey home. And it's on that journey that he finds himself fighting with God. And he was given a new name, not Jacob, but Israel, which means wrestles with God.
I wonder if the fighting was literal or metaphorical. I don't suppose it really matters in many ways, actually. Jacob's encounter may have been an actual flesh and blood wrestle, but I'm sure many of us have felt that we're fighting with God in one way or another at times, perhaps when our prayers are unanswered, when life is particularly difficult, or maybe when we're struggling with some doubts about our faith.
That's true. There's another part of the Jacob story we should think about too. When Jacob was actually on his way to Uncle Laban, one night on the 400-mile journey, he slept and had a dream. He dreamt of a stairway to heaven. This is long before Led Zeppelin and Robert Plant sang of it. This was the original. It was at a place that he called Bethel, the house of God. But in his dream, God spoke to him, and God promised to bless him. And this was just before all the problems caused by Uncle Laban.
I suppose he felt very blessed while working for his rather unpleasant-sounding uncle. But if you read the story, you'll see that his reunion with Esau went very well. Although the rest of his life wasn't always full of joy, was it?
Not always full of joy, no. Rachel, his favourite wife, died giving birth to Benjamin, and that was while she was still relatively young. And as anyone who has seen the famous musical know, Joseph, Jacob's favourite son, annoyed his brothers, who stole his amazing Technicolor dreamcoat, threw him in a pit, and then sold him to be taken as a slave to Egypt. Then they lied to Jacob, saying that Joseph had been killed by a wild animal, and he was devastated, gutted. Not the best way for sons to treat their father. And on top of all that, he and his family had to endure a long famine. Definitely not an easy life, not sounding so blessed. So was God really still honouring his promise to bless Jacob?
Well, it has to be said that Joseph certainly thought so. Again, if you've seen the musical, you know that using his God-given gift of interpreting dreams, he'd been promoted to second in command to Pharaoh himself and put in charge of building up stores of food for the famine that he'd foreseen when he was asked to work out what Pharaoh's dream was all about. And then when his brothers came to Egypt, pleading for food because of the famine and the drought, and because their own harvest had repeatedly failed, he gave them some, quite generous amounts actually. But his brothers didn't recognise him. And in his Egyptian clothes and makeup and wig, perhaps that's not so surprising. But Joseph eventually revealed to them his true identity. And when they knew it was the brothers that they'd sold to slavery and tried to apologise to him, he said there was no need to apologise because God himself had looked after him and sent him to Egypt so that he could save many, including his own family, from starvation. And then Jacob and all his family were invited to move to Egypt for the duration of the famine. And there was still plenty of food. God was still keeping his promise.
So everything worked out for the God wrestler in the end then. But are there other occasions when people have felt like they're wrestling with God?
Again, I suppose it depends exactly what you mean about that. But if it's about struggling with God in prayer, and many people have used it as a metaphor for that, then you could look at Jesus in Gethsemane as he prayed in absolute anguish, knowing that he faced so much suffering, and be whipped and beaten and die on the cross the next day. Over and over again he prayed, Father, if it's possible, let this cup, this suffering, be taken from me. But not what I want to happen, what you will be done.
Yeah. And perhaps St. Paul, he spoke about a problem that he had, and he called it his thorn in the flesh, which was a torment to him. 3 times he said he asked God to take it away from him, but he got the answer back, my grace is sufficient for you.
That's a couple of good examples from the Bible. Do you think it means anything to us today?
Maybe it is simply that we need to take God's promises seriously. I mean, there's so many promises in the Bible. One I like is Jesus saying, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest, for my yoke is easy, my burden is light.
Yes, Phil preached about that one a couple of weeks ago, didn't he? And St. Paul talked about other promises. We know that in all things God works for our good. And also nothing can separate us from the love of God. Not height or depth, death or life, not angels or principalities, or even coronavirus regulations.
Yes. And for Jesus, what followed that anguished prayer at Gethsemane wasn't just the cross, but on the third day came resurrection. Because God, our God, is a God of resurrection, a God of new life. After his resurrection, Jesus made another promise. I am with you always, even to the end of time.
And there are dozens of other promises like these in the Bible. And in tough times, so many have found them to be true.
Yes, it's true. But thinking back to Jacob, there's one detail we didn't mention in the wrestling story. That odd detail, God injuring Jacob's hip to stop the fight. And you look at it and you think at first glance, it looks like God's cheating to make sure that he won. But then on reflection, you think, well, God could win instantly if he wanted to. So what's it telling us? Is it just telling us that God is always greater than we are, that fighting and struggling won't get us anywhere? What we need to do is simply stop stressing and put our trust in God and his promises, just as Jesus did when he suffered so much.
But that's easier said than done sometimes, isn't it? When I had my cancer diagnosis early this year, I'd have to admit that I was very, very angry with God. The last thing I wanted to be told was to stop worrying or to trust God and not be afraid, especially as the coronavirus and lockdown made things even harder for us. In fact, one of the chaplains I worked with said, feel free to be as angry with God as you want to. He can take it, and he likes you to be honest. I think he was right about that. But as I look back over the last few months, I can honestly say that I've become very aware of God being with me through the treatment and all that's gone with that. Both when the news was bad, for example, when I heard I'd need a second operation, and when things got better and test results were much more positive. Obviously, God didn't stop me getting cancer. But then we all live in a gone wrong world, don't we? And we know that the Bible tells us it's true. A world where these things happen to Christians and non-Christians alike. And when I did feel able to pray again, I asked God to take the cancer away because I just felt I couldn't cope with it. That didn't happen either. Well, it did happen, it's gone now, but that was through surgery and other treatments that I've had. And yet, God most definitely was with me. Fortunately, he doesn't turn away if we get cross with him. And he helped me to cope, in part through all the support I got from other Christians in this circuit and elsewhere. Talking to my consultant just after my diagnosis, it became clear that he was a Christian, which led to conversations about the causes of cancer and disease in bodies that God has designed. And I found it very helpful. And then, because so much of the usual support given to cancer patients has been unavailable because of the coronavirus, Macmillan Cancer Support arranges for a supporter to ring those having treatment every couple of weeks just for a chat to see how they're doing. And it turned out the one allocated to me, just chosen because she happened to live closer to me than the others on the list that were available, was a Christian too. And one more thing, earlier this month I said to her, last month, it's August, I forgot, yes. Earlier last month I said to her and to Carl, I'd love to have the chance to talk to somebody who has experienced breast cancer and recovered. Out of the blue, 3 or 4 days later, I had an email from a lady in this circle in exactly that situation who felt that she ought to get in touch with me. So no, I can't say that God protects Christians from suffering, and why would he? He suffered so much himself in Jesus. But he doesn't leave them to go through it on their own either. That I'm sure of.
We're all in very, very difficult and uncertain times at the moment. And even as lockdown eases, there's still so much uncertainty and fear. Maybe we're all struggling with why God's doing things, and maybe we just need to stop fighting God and do simply just trust him to keep the promises. It can be tough. It certainly has been tough at times, but he is the God who is there. He knows us and he made us and he continues to love us.